Every night, long after most of the world has fallen asleep, voices travel across the airwaves, lonely voices, searching for someone to listen. For decades, people have trusted the quiet comfort of late-night radio to keep them company in the dark. But what happens when the voice that answers doesn't belong to the living? Imagine tuning in to your favorite late-night radio show, only to hear your name spoken softly, as though the caller can see you, your room, your clothes, the way you sit in the dark, and then, in a whisper so faint you almost doubt it. They say they've been dead for years. This is not just another ghost story. This is the tale of a broadcast that blurred the line between entertainment and the unknown. A story of sound waves that carried more than music or words. A story of voices that traveled through the static. Voices that should never have been heard. For as long as there have been radios, there have been whispers of strange transmissions. Late-night hosts reporting calls from numbers that didn't exist. Recordings that captured sounds no one in the studio had heard. Voices fading in from the static, speaking in languages no one could recognize. Some say it's interference. Some say it's a trick of the mind. But others believe the airwaves themselves can become a bridge between this world and whatever lies beyond it. And tonight, we'll uncover one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded. The story of Daniel Price, a late-night radio host whose calm voice became a lifeline for the lonely and restless. Until the night he picked up a call that no living person could have made. A call that changed everything. By the end of this video, you'll know why Daniel's final broadcast is still whispered about in radio stations around the world. And you'll hear why some engineers believe that recording should have been destroyed decades ago. Daniel Price was not a celebrity. He wasn't the kind of radio host who filled arenas or made headlines. He was a quiet man in a quiet town, with a voice that kept people company when the rest of the world had gone to sleep. His show, Midnight Confessions, was simple. Lonely hearts, truck drivers on endless highways, insomniacs too restless for silence. Night after night, Daniel listened to strangers spill their secrets into the dark. It was his routine, his ritual, his comfort. The studio was small, bare walls, old carpet, a single fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered when the storm rolled in. Behind the glass, the soundboard blinked with quiet precision, and above the door, a red light glowed, on air. For Daniel, that glow meant safety, his invisible connection to thousands of listeners scattered in the night. But safety is never what it seems. On the night it all began, a storm hammered the town. Rain tapped against the studio windows. Thunder rolled over the airwaves. Daniel welcomed his listeners the way he always did, with warmth, with patience. The phone lines lit up, and the first caller was different. The voice was fragile, whispery, almost lost beneath the static. A woman speaking so softly Daniel had to lean closer to his headphones. Her first words were chilling. "It's so cold here, but I used to live where you do." Daniel chuckled nervously. To him, it had to be a prank. Radio attracts all kinds, drunks, teenagers, people looking for attention. But something about her tone unsettled him. There was no laughter in it, no trick, just emptiness. He asked where she was calling from. The line crackled. She never answered, just repeated herself, softer this time. "I used to live where you do." Then the line went dead. Daniel shook it off. He was used to strange callers. But outside, the storm deepened. And inside the studio, the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer across the walls. Now ask yourself, would you have kept listening to a voice like that? Or would you have hung up immediately, before it could say another word? Daniel didn't know it yet. But the next caller would change everything. At first, Daniel brushed it off. Radio attracts its share of strange voices, people chasing attention, pranksters testing the limits. But the calls kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. The next caller's voice didn't sound human at all. It wavered, as though echoing down a long tunnel, words stretching and breaking apart in the static. The man spoke slowly, with pauses that dragged too long between breaths. His first words chilled Daniel to the core. "I never made it home from the accident. Do you remember me?" Daniel stiffened. Weeks earlier, a car crash had taken the lives of 2 local residents on a rain-slicked road just outside of town. The story had made headlines, and now someone, or something, was calling his show, claiming to be one of the dead. He wanted to hang up, but his training told him to continue. The show must go on. And so he stayed, his voice calm for the listeners, even as his hands trembled on the soundboard. Then the calls began to change. These weren't random confessions anymore. They were precise, personal. One voice described the studio itself. "There's a coffee cup by your hand," it whispered. "You just looked at the clock. Don't turn around." Daniel froze in his chair. He had indeed just looked at the clock. The caller shouldn't have known that, couldn't have known that. And yet, the voice described every detail as if it were standing directly behind him. Meanwhile, his listeners noticed. Messages flooded the station's online board. Was it a performance, a prank, or something worse? Viewers debated in real time, half convinced they were hearing the greatest live stunt in radio history, the other half terrified. It wasn't a stunt at all. And then it happened. The line clicked. Static hissed, and through the distortion, the voice said his full name, clearly, deliberately, as if the speaker was sitting in the very same room. In that instant, Daniel realized he was no longer in control of the broadcast. Daniel froze as the voice cut through the static. "Daniel Price, we've been waiting for you." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a threat. It was a statement, calm, certain, as though the voice had been expecting this night all along. Before he could respond, the temperature in the studio plummeted. A cold wind swept across the soundboard, lifting the papers on his desk, though the windows were shut tight. The storm outside was sealed away. And yet, inside, Daniel shivered as his breath fogged the glass before him. The call stopped just long enough for Daniel to catch his breath, but he couldn't shake the unease, the way the voice knew his name, the way it said, "we." So during a break, he searched the archives. Dusty boxes lined the back room, tapes, transcripts, and old clippings no one had touched in decades. And there, under yellowed sheets of paper, he found it, an article from 1963. The headline read, "Local DJ Missing After Strange Broadcast." The story told of a man, another late-night host, who vanished without a trace during a storm. The only clue? Listeners swore they heard voices through the static that night. Voices that weren't his. Daniel's stomach sank. This wasn't the first time. He wasn't the first host. Something tied to this station, to this very room, had been happening for years. That night, the lines lit up again. But this time, it wasn't a single caller. It was many. Dozens of whispers layered on top of one another, spilling into the studio like a crowd pressing against locked doors. Words melted into each other, impossible to separate, until one clear voice rose above the rest. "Check the archives. We're all still there." Driven by dread and curiosity, Daniel dug deeper into the reels. Fingers shaking, he loaded one into the player. The tape hissed, crackled, and then began to play. At first, it was the sound of a long-forgotten broadcast. But then, his heart stopped. It was his own voice, Daniel Price, recorded decades before he was even born. And in that moment, the past reached out and swallowed the present whole. On his final night, Daniel Price walked into the studio as he always had. But this time, the air felt different. Thick, charged, as though the storm outside had seeped into the very walls. The fluorescent light above him buzzed and flickered, shadows stretching too long across the empty control room. He adjusted his microphone, placed his coffee mug on the desk, and hit the switch. The red on-air sign glowed to life, but Daniel didn't feel alone. Within seconds, the phone lines lit up, every single one. Caller after caller, voices spilling through. But this time, there was no mistaking it. Every single one claimed the same thing. They were dead. The whispers bled together, building into a roar. Daniel clutched his headphones, trying to separate one voice from another. And then, everything went silent. Daniel froze. The studio lights flickered violently, the soundboard rattled, and the microphone stand began to tremble. The red on-air sign above him sparked, hissed, and then... His producer, watching in horror from the other side of the glass, rushed to the booth door. But no matter how hard he pulled, the handle wouldn't budge. Something was holding it shut. Inside, Daniel clung to his microphone, begging for answers. The static climbed higher, louder, until it drowned out every word. The calls came again, layered and endless, until the voices became a single, deafening chant. The walls shook, papers flew across the room, and the broadcast equipment sparked as though the entire station were tearing itself apart. And then, Daniel screamed, a scream so raw it pierced the static itself. And then, nothing. The feed cut to black. The static swallowed everything whole. That was the last anyone heard from Daniel Price. Live. When police arrived at the station the next morning, the studio door was unlocked. Inside, there was no sign of Daniel Price. His headphones lay on the desk, the coffee cup still warm. The chair at his console spun slowly, as if someone had just stood up and walked away. The broadcast equipment was still running. The red on-air light burned faintly, flickering as though refusing to die. But the strangest part was the recording. The station's backup tape existed, but entire sections were blank. Hours of static, broken only by fragments of Daniel's voice, screaming, whispering, then fading into silence. To this day, locals swear that if you tune your radio late at night, somewhere between the dead frequencies, you can still hear him. A voice calling through the static. Sometimes it's his name. Sometimes it's yours. So tonight, if you can't sleep and your radio begins to crackle with a voice you don't recognize, don't answer. Because you may be tuning in to the last broadcast. If this story kept you awake, subscribe, if you dare, and tell me in the comments, would you keep listening or would you turn the radio off?